I've said this many times before, but my feeling is that bodybuilding has hijacked the fitness industry. Now, I appreciate a massive irony here, because you could argue that if it wasn't for bodybuilding, we might not have any kind of organized health and fitness system at all. Physical strength and fitness can rarely be separated into the pre and post steroid era. If you go back to the pre-steroid era, we're looking at, going back turn of the century. If you look at who is considered to be the father of bodybuilding, Eugen Sandow, the kind of lifts that he used to do were very different, or are very different, than the kinds of lifts that became popular and that you'll see in the pages of, Flex magazine, if Flex magazine is still going. If you look back at the kind of lifts they used to do then, the focus was very, very different. It was more of a focus on athleticism, ability, strength, a kind of performance, a kind of like strongman kind of approach that was also a little bit gymnastic. Essentially, this was performance over aesthetic. The post-steroid bodybuilding boom we saw in the 60s, the late 60s moving on, basically fundamentally changed the way we approached exercise and ultimately health and fitness. First, I want to say that regardless of what I think about steroids and bodybuilding in general, we owe a huge debt of gratitude for keeping fitness. And, if it wasn't for bodybuilding, if it wasn't for the pioneers, Weider and Schwarzenegger and all these guys back in the day, there wouldn't be all these gyms that we have now and we have access to. And you're seeing new things come in and a change maybe, but by and large, people still do bodybuilding. So it helped to provide a general direction. But if you go to the extremes of bodybuilding, which ultimately is as much muscle mass as you can physically fit on a frame, then that pinnacle of bodybuilding ultimately isn't a very healthy person. And I mean that in terms of the physicality, but also potentially the psychology and the mental well-being, we should say. Because bodybuilding is rife with insecurity. And this is the part of my main gripe with bodybuilding. So let's go back to what I was originally talking about, how bodybuilding has molded the health and fitness industry, and what I would say are the two main problems with this. Steroids has changed our perception of what it means to be a physical, strong, muscular, athletic man. And it has also created an incredible amount of insecurity amongst men. Number two, because of number one, training programs are really geared towards reinforcing this kind of negative and, for most people, unachievable stereotype. And it's unachievable unless you go down the drug route. If all you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail. This is essentially the bodybuilding mentality. Bodybuilding is good if you want to be a bodybuilder, but in reality, bodybuilding style training doesn't reflect the way we move and how we interact with things in the real world. At the end of the day, everything doesn't have a handle on it, and you don't need to be lying down or sat down to push, pull, or lift things. You're always going to be on your feet generally, or moving around in this three-dimensional world we live in. Research for the best practices on bodybuilding has changed. It's not the 60s anymore. This double split, doing 20 sets per body part, it's totally unnecessary. Don't forget about the confirmation bias of when you see a big jacked bodybuilder saying he does 20 sets. It almost doesn't matter what this guy does because he's taken so much juice and so many different kinds of performance-enhancing drugs. He could basically just look at weights and he would get a result. Obviously, I'm exaggerating. They still work hard, but it doesn't mean that what they're doing is the best way to do it. The research is out there. The research is clear on the best practices for bodybuilding. And it's quite clear. People do way too much. You don't need to do as much to get the same results. So what that does is it gives us lots more time in the gym to do other things, things that you might neglect, and things that will ultimately make you a better, more functional human being. So if we don't need to be focusing on bodybuilding style training, what should we be focusing on? First off, if you enjoy bodybuilding, carry on doing bodybuilding. It's not to me to tell you what to do. If you enjoy doing lots of sets, if that's your thing, if it's your ritual, carry on doing it. at the end of the day, it's not as if we're throwing out all of the bodybuilding style training. Barbells, dumbbells, benches, these tools all stay in place and remain, but I would use them in a slightly different way. And I would use them in a different way because spending too much time doing that other kind of training basically just robs you of time that you could do and spend to complement other things in the gym. So if your aim, and this applies, I believe, to 99% of the people out there, if your aim is to be fitter, stronger, more muscular, lower fat percentage, have good coordination, good balance, the ability to jump, run, sprint, throw, change direction, be explosive, be dynamic, be supple, be flexible, then these are the things you need to focus on in the gym that can replace that traditional bodybuilding dirge. Here are the 3 things that you can focus on that will make the biggest difference to your training outcomes. Focus on functional exercises, functional lifts, presses, pulls, etc. that focus on core strength, balance, and ideally have an element of ground contact. By nature, this will remove your fixed resistance machines, which again are just not functional. They might be good at building a bit of muscle on the shoulder, for example, but they're not good when you tie this into the rest of the body. These kind of exercises, functional exercises, can achieve the exact same thing, but you get a better outcome because you're bringing in the rest of the body. Number 2, spend more time warming up. I've just done another video on this that argues that the warm-up is potentially the most important thing you do in your workout, because the warm-up, or a good warm-up, should incorporate things like mobility, flexibility, range of motion. It should also include things like balance, coordination, aerobic, anaerobic fitness, some power exercise crossing over into your main routine. And number 3 is put your training into practice. I do something I call the shit hits the fan, or worst case scenario training. It's all well and good being sat in a leg press and pressing a sled, or lying on the floor and pressing a chest press or a Smith machine. But that doesn't have a huge amount of payoff when it comes to the real world, when you need to quickly run to something, pick something up, throw something over a fence, grab something, carry it, move it from one location to the other, pick something up, drag it out the way in an emergency. These are the kind of things that you can do as scenarios in your routine, and have the visualization that that's what these things are for. Be dynamic with your ability.